There exists in every soul a hidden wound, a fracture, not always seen by the outer eye, but deeply felt in moments of stillness. The addict is not merely one who craves a drug or a drink. They are one who has lost the thread of their own becoming. They seek a balm, not for the body, but for a soul that has grown disoriented in a world of hollow certainties. What the world calls addiction, the psyche may recognize as a cry for transcendence. The wine, the needle, the screen, the obsession, these are not the problem, they are the symbols. Symbols of an inner emptiness, of a longing that no material thing can satisfy. The addict, more than most, is aware, though unconsciously, of the unbearable weight of being, and they flee into oblivion, not because they are weak, but because they have tasted a suffering that cannot be spoken. In the labyrinth of the human soul, there lies a yearning so profound that it defies the capacity of ordinary words to capture its essence. This yearning is not merely for pleasure or comfort. It is a deep spiritual hunger, a longing for something beyond the confines of the visible world and the material realm. The modern individual, caught in the ceaseless motion of external demands and fragmented experiences, often finds this hunger unaddressed, and the void it creates becomes a chasm difficult to bear. It is within this chasm that the phenomenon of addiction takes root, not simply as a physical or psychological dependency, but as an unconscious attempt to fill a spiritual emptiness. The addict is in many ways a pilgrim lost upon a barren path. The substances or behaviors to which they cling serve as false lodestones, promising the illusion of wholeness and completion, but delivering only fleeting shadows of satisfaction. These false lodestones often appear as powerful and seductive as the archetypes of myth, calling to the addict with the voice of an ancient siren. Yet, their call leads not toward transformation or illumination, but deeper into disintegration and despair. The addiction then must be seen not as a mere disease of the body or a disorder of the mind, but as a symptom of a deeper spiritual crisis, a crisis born from the neglect of the soul's essential hunger. This spiritual hunger is not something easily acknowledged in the world of external achievements and measurable success. The dominant culture, with its fixation on material progress and sensory gratification, tends to dismiss the inner void as a mere psychological defect or a personal weakness. Yet the soul's yearning is irrepressible. It seeks expression and fulfillment, often in ways that confound logic and reason. When the conscious mind refuses or fails to recognize this hunger, the unconscious moves to satisfy it in ways that may appear destructive or pathological. Addiction, therefore, can be understood as a compensatory mechanism, an unconscious effort by the psyche to restore a lost sense of meaning, connection, and transcendence. At the core of this process lies the tension between the conscious ego and the unconscious depths. The ego, with its rational and practical orientation, often perceives spiritual matters as vague, irrelevant, or even threatening. In its striving to maintain control and order, the ego neglects the mysterious realm of the spirit, the domain of symbols, myths, and the numinous. However, the spirit, which may be understood as the life force of the psyche, refuses to be silenced or ignored. When denied direct expression through conscious channels such as ritual, creativity, or meaningful relationships, the spirit's voice turns to indirect means, often through the language of addiction. Addiction then emerges as a substitute for authentic spiritual experience. The intoxicating substance or compulsive behavior acts as a temporary portal, an altered state, through which the addict briefly glimpses a reality beyond the mundane. This glimpse, though illusory and transient, is a vital reminder of the soul's deeper needs. The euphoric or numbing effect provides a false transcendence, a fleeting escape from the unbearable awareness of emptiness. Yet this escape is ultimately self-defeating, because it bypasses the very process of transformation the soul requires. This substitution, while offering temporary relief, carries with it a profound paradox. The very mechanism that the psyche employs to soothe its hunger becomes the source of further fragmentation and alienation. The addict is caught in a vicious cycle, repeatedly drawn toward the false promise of transcendence offered by the addiction, only to be left increasingly isolated and disoriented. The spiritual hunger remains unsatisfied. While the addiction deepens its grip, the soul is starved, and the body and mind suffer in parallel. Understanding addiction as a spiritual issue requires a radical shift in perspective. It calls for recognizing that the soul's hunger is not an aberration, but a fundamental aspect of human existence. This hunger is what compels us to seek meaning beyond survival, to reach for connection beyond the self, and to aspire toward wholeness in the face of fragmentation. Addiction obscures these aspirations but cannot extinguish them. Beneath the layers of dependency and despair, the soul's call persists, sometimes faintly, sometimes with urgent insistence. One of the greatest tragedies of addiction lies in its ability to obscure the spiritual dimension of the human experience, from both the addict and those around them. The addict may be viewed simply as a person trapped by a moral failing or a medical condition, while the deeper spiritual suffering remains hidden beneath the surface. The culture's emphasis on diagnosis and treatment, while necessary, often neglects this profound existential dimension. Without addressing the soul's hunger, recovery risks becoming merely a process of abstinence, a cessation of harmful behavior rather than a true rebirth. To comprehend this spiritual dimension, it is helpful to consider the nature of the soul itself. The soul may be described as the animating principle of life, the source of meaning and purpose that transcends the individual ego. It is the inner presence that calls us toward wholeness, balance, and integration. When the soul is neglected, the individual becomes fragmented, disconnected from their own center and from the greater totality of existence. Addiction is one form this fragmentation takes, an externalization of inner chaos and a symptom of a fractured spirit. This fragmentation is often accompanied by profound feelings of emptiness and alienation. The addict experiences a gnawing void within, a sense of being incomplete or hollow. This emptiness is not merely the absence of something, but a presence of loss, of unfulfilled longing, of a self divided against itself. The addict may try to fill this void with external objects or experiences, but such attempts are doomed to fail because the soul's hunger cannot be satiated by externals alone. The spiritual hunger that underlies addiction is closely linked to the human need for connection. Connection to the self, to others, and to a transcendent reality. Addiction often arises from a rupture in these connections, whether due to trauma, isolation, or existential despair. The addict may have lost touch with their authentic self, their true desires and values. They may feel estranged from their community, lacking meaningful relationships or support, and they may feel cut off from a sense of the sacred or the divine, a numinous presence that gives life depth and significance. In this light, addiction can be seen as an attempt to restore these broken connections, albeit in a distorted and maladaptive way. The substance or behavior offers the illusion of communion, a temporary bridging of the gulf between self and other, self and spirit. The addict may experience moments of intense intimacy with the object of their addiction, a sense of oneness or fusion that, while illusory, is deeply compelling. This experience points to the soul's need for unity and integration, a need that must ultimately be met in healthier and more authentic ways. Recovery, then, is not simply about relinquishing the addictive behavior. It is about reclaiming the spiritual dimension of the self. It involves awakening to the soul's call and embarking on a journey of inner discovery and transformation. This journey requires courage, humility, and a willingness to face the darkness within. The addict must learn to listen to the voice of the soul beneath the noise of addiction, to recognize the true nature of their hunger, and to seek nourishment that comes not from outside but from within. The path to spiritual fulfillment is often difficult and uncertain. It may involve confronting painful memories, unresolved conflicts, and aspects of the self that have long been denied or hidden. It may require the cultivation of practices that foster connection, meaning, and transcendence, such as meditation, prayer, creative expression, or engagement with nature. It may also involve participation in a community that supports the individual's growth and healing. Importantly, this path is not about achieving a state of perfection or permanent bliss. The soul's journey is one of ongoing movement between light and shadow, order and chaos, loss and renewal. Spiritual fulfillment does not mean the absence of suffering, but the presence of meaning and purpose amid suffering. It means embracing the fullness of life, including its contradictions and mysteries. In recognizing addiction as a substitute for spiritual fulfillment, we open the door to a more compassionate and holistic understanding of the addict's experience. We see beyond the surface behaviors to the deeper spiritual wounds and yearnings that drive them. We acknowledge the profound complexity of the human psyche and the vital role of the soul in healing and transformation. This perspective invites us to expand our approaches to treatment and recovery. It challenges us to integrate spiritual care alongside psychological and medical interventions. It calls for creating spaces where the soul can be heard and nurtured, a sanctuary within the self and within the community. It encourages the cultivation of awareness, presence, and authentic connection as antidotes to the alienation that fuels addiction. Ultimately, the recognition of addiction as a spiritual hunger invites the addict and all who accompany them to embark on a sacred journey. It is a journey back to the center, back to the self, and back to the source of life's deepest meaning. It is a journey of reclaiming wholeness, not by denying the darkness, but by embracing it as part of the soul's unfolding story. In the hidden recesses of the human psyche, there dwells a force both mysterious and powerful, a part of ourselves that we seldom acknowledge, yet one that shapes our inner life and outer behavior with profound effect. This is the shadow, the unconscious realm of rejected, repressed, or disowned aspects of the self. It is a repository for everything that the conscious ego refuses to claim. Traits, impulses, memories, and desires deemed unacceptable, dangerous, or shameful. The shadow is not simply a collection of negatives. It is the part of the personality that remains unknown or hidden, often because of social conditioning, personal trauma, or self-denial. It is both a source of potential destruction and a reservoir of untapped vitality. In the life of an addict, the shadow assumes a particular and compelling significance, for addiction is often the outward expression of a psyche possessed or overwhelmed by these shadow elements. The notion that the addict is possessed by the shadow captures a fundamental truth about the inner dynamics of addiction. It suggests that addiction is not merely a failure of willpower or a simple habit, but a manifestation of deeper psychic conflicts. The addict is not simply a passive sufferer, but someone engaged in an intense, often unconscious struggle with the darker regions of their own being. The substance or behavior to which they are addicted becomes a vessel through which the shadow expresses itself, a tangible symbol of inner turmoil that has been denied conscious recognition. To understand this dynamic, one must first grasp the nature of the shadow itself. The shadow is the counterpart to the conscious ego, the other side of the self, that remains hidden because it contradicts the ego's self-image. The ego, formed through socialization and personal identification, seeks to present a coherent, acceptable persona to the world. In doing so, it excludes those parts of the self that do not fit the ideal or that evoke fear and discomfort. These excluded parts do not vanish, but are relegated to the unconscious, where they accumulate and gain strength. The shadow often embodies qualities that the ego finds threatening: anger, greed, envy, lust, cowardice, selfishness, and more. It also holds repressed memories, unresolved traumas, and infantile wounds that the conscious mind prefers to forget. When the shadow remains unconscious, it exerts a subtle but insistent influence on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, often in ways that are contrary to the ego's intentions. It is this influence that can lead the individual into patterns of self-sabotage, projection, and compulsive behavior. In the addict's psyche, the shadow frequently dominates. The addictive behavior serves as an expression of shadow energy, a way of acting out those parts of the self that the ego disowns. The addiction can be understood as a form of possession, where the individual is controlled by impulses and desires that originate in the shadow. The substance or compulsion becomes a means of giving voice and form to these shadow elements, albeit in a distorted and harmful way. This possession by the shadow creates a profound internal conflict. The ego is often aware, at some level, of the destructive nature of addiction, and may attempt to resist or control it. Yet the shadow, having been repressed for so long, emerges with overwhelming force, driving the addict toward repeated behaviors that betray their conscious goals. This conflict manifests as ambivalence, shame, guilt, and despair, a psychic war in which the conscious self struggles to maintain sovereignty against the insurgent shadow. The addictive substance or behavior functions symbolically as a mediator between the conscious ego and the shadow. It offers an escape from the tension of inner conflict by providing temporary relief or numbing. At moments of use, the addict may experience a dissolution of boundaries, a loosening of repression, or a false sense of integration. This experience, though illusory, reveals the underlying yearning for wholeness that lies at the heart of the struggle. The shadow's energy is powerful, precisely because it contains life forces that have been cut off from conscious awareness. When these energies are expressed through addiction, they are distorted, but also reveal the soul's need for integration and transformation. To speak of the addict as possessed by the shadow is not to deny their agency or responsibility, but to acknowledge the complexity of the forces at work within. It points to the need for a therapeutic approach that goes beyond mere symptom control and addresses the unconscious material driving the behavior. Healing requires bringing the shadow into consciousness, a process that is often painful and challenging, but necessary for reclaiming psychic wholeness. This process of shadow integration involves recognizing and accepting the disowned parts of the self. It requires a willingness to face one's own darkness without judgment or denial. The addict must learn to see their shadow not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a neglected aspect of their own being that longs for acknowledgement and understanding. This requires courage, honesty, and humility, for the shadow often reveals uncomfortable truths about ourselves. The journey toward integration is facilitated by a variety of practices that encourage self-reflection, such as dream analysis, active imagination, creative expression, and dialogue with trusted others. These methods allow the unconscious contents of the shadow to surface in symbolic form, providing an opportunity for conscious engagement. In this encounter, the addict begins to reclaim the energy and meaning that were lost in repression and displacement. An important aspect of this work is recognizing projection, the psychological mechanism by which the shadow's qualities are attributed to others, rather than accepted as one's own. The addict often projects shame, anger, or fear onto external objects or people, blaming them for their suffering. By bringing projection into awareness, the human can begin to take responsibility for their inner life and break free from repetitive patterns of blame and victimization. The possession by the shadow also explains the compulsive nature of addiction. Compulsion arises because the shadow's energy, when unconscious, exerts pressure on the ego that feels uncontrollable. The addiction becomes a way to discharge this pressure, a ritual that momentarily pacifies the inner tumult. Yet this relief is temporary, and the compulsion returns with greater intensity. The addict is trapped in a cycle of suppression and eruption, seeking relief in the very behavior that perpetuates the conflict. Understanding the shadow's role in addiction invites a compassionate stance toward the addict's suffering. It reminds us that beneath the behavior lies a wounded self struggling to survive and find coherence. It calls for an approach that honors the depth and complexity of the psyche, rather than reducing addiction to moral failing or mere pathology. This perspective also opens the door to transformation. The shadow, while dangerous and destructive if left unconscious, contains within it the seeds of growth and creativity. When integrated, the shadow enriches the personality by expanding its range of experience and expression. The energy that once fueled addiction can be redirected toward constructive and meaningful pursuits. The addict, having confronted and embraced their shadow, can emerge with a greater sense of wholeness and authenticity. The recognition of the addict's possession by the shadow also challenges cultural attitudes toward addiction. It questions simplistic narratives of good versus evil and invites a more nuanced understanding of human complexity. It encourages society to create spaces for healing that include psychological, spiritual, and communal dimensions. Addiction is not merely a personal failure, but a manifestation of deeper psychic and social realities that demand attention and care. In therapeutic practice, addressing the shadow involves creating a safe environment in which the addict can explore painful feelings and memories. It means supporting the individual in reclaiming disowned parts of themselves and integrating these into a more cohesive self-concept. It also means acknowledging the spiritual dimension of addiction, recognizing that the shadow's possession often signals a soul in distress. This understanding transforms recovery into a profound inner journey, one that encompasses not only abstinence from substance or behavior, but a reorientation of the self toward integration and healing. The addict is invited to become a witness to their own shadow, to listen to its messages, and to transform its energy through conscious awareness. The process is neither quick nor easy. It requires persistence and patience, as the shadow resists exposure and integration. Yet the rewards are great: a reclaimed sense of self, a deepened capacity for love and creativity, and a renewed connection to the sacred dimensions of life. In the end, the addict's possession by the shadow is a call to awakening. It reveals the fractured nature of the self and the potential for wholeness that lies beyond fragmentation. By embracing the shadow, the addict embarks on the path toward healing, reclaiming lost parts of the soul and finding freedom in integration. Human existence is inevitably marked by conflict and pain, for within the psyche reside tensions between opposing forces, desires and demands. These inner struggles are fundamental to the nature of consciousness and identity. The self is not a simple, unified entity but a complex constellation of parts, each with its own impulses, fears and longings. From the earliest moments of life, the individual encounters ambivalence and contradiction. The need for autonomy clashes with the need for connection. The desire for freedom contends with the need for security. Light is always shadowed by darkness. This psychic tension, while often a source of growth and transformation, can also become overwhelming and unbearable. It is this unbearable psychic tension that the addict seeks to escape through the seductive refuge of substance or compulsive behavior. At the core of addiction lies a profound attempt to flee from the pain and conflict that reside in the depths of the psyche. Addiction is not simply a habit or a physical dependence. It is a desperate effort to avoid confrontation with the self's inner turmoil. The addict's behavior expresses a refusal, whether conscious or unconscious, to endure the suffering that accompanies self-awareness and psychic integration. Instead of facing the contradictions and wounds that make up the inner landscape, the addict turns outward, seeking relief in something external that promises ease and forgetfulness. This flight from inner conflict is rooted in the nature of pain itself, which is often misunderstood and rejected. Pain is not only physical but profoundly psychological and spiritual. It arises from loss, trauma, unfulfilled needs, alienation, and the fragmentation of the self. The pain of feeling incomplete, isolated, or powerless is often unbearable. It strikes at the very core of the individual's being, threatening to dissolve identity and meaning. Faced with such suffering, the psyche may resort to avoidance strategies that temporarily dull or distract from the pain, but at great cost. The addictive behavior functions as one such avoidance strategy. The substance or compulsion offers a numbing or dissociative effect that masks the inner agony. It provides an illusion of control and safety, a temporary escape from the reality of psychic wounds. In the moment of intoxication or engagement, the addict may experience a reprieve from anxiety, despair, loneliness, or self-criticism. This experience is deeply seductive because it answers a primal need for relief and peace. Yet this relief is illusory and transient. The underlying conflicts and pains remain unresolved, lurking beneath the surface, ready to resurface with greater intensity when the effects of the addictive behavior fade. The addict becomes trapped in a vicious cycle. The initial flight from pain leads to further fragmentation and suffering, which in turn drives the need for greater escape. Over time, the addictive pattern deepens, making it increasingly difficult for the individual to face the inner realities they seek to avoid. To understand addiction as an attempt to escape inner conflict is to recognize the profound ambivalence at its heart. The addict both desires and fears healing, both craves connection and withdraws from it. This ambivalence often manifests as a split within the self, a division between the part that longs for wholeness and the part that resists it. The addictive behavior becomes a battleground for these opposing forces, reflecting the psychic schism that lies beneath the surface. This inner conflict is not random, but rooted in developmental and existential factors. Early wounds, neglect, trauma, and loss can leave the psyche fragmented and vulnerable. The individual may have learned to dissociate from painful emotions or to deny aspects of themselves that were unacceptable or dangerous in their environment. These defensive strategies, while protective at first, create a divided self that struggles to integrate its disparate parts. Addiction arises in this fissure as a way to manage the unbearable tension created by this fragmentation. Moreover, the conflict is often intensified by cultural and societal pressures that deny or distort the expression of pain. Many cultures valorize strength, productivity, and emotional control, leaving little room for vulnerability or suffering. The individual who experiences inner turmoil may feel isolated or ashamed, further deepening the need to conceal pain through addictive behaviors. The social stigma surrounding addiction compounds this isolation, reinforcing the sense of alienation and self-rejection. The addict's struggle is thus not only psychological but also existential. It involves questions of meaning, identity, and purpose. The pain and conflict they seek to escape often relate to fundamental concerns about the self's place in the world, the experience of separation from others, and the confrontation with mortality and finitude. Addiction becomes a way to avoid the anxiety and despair that these questions evoke, even as it perpetuates the very suffering it seeks to alleviate. Healing from addiction, therefore, requires more than abstinence or behavioral change. It calls for a willingness to face the inner conflict and pain that underlie the addictive pattern. This confrontation is neither easy nor comfortable. It demands courage, honesty, and a readiness to endure suffering without immediate relief. Yet it is through this engagement that the possibility of transformation arises. The process of facing inner conflict involves exploring the unconscious realms of the psyche, where much of this pain resides. Dreams, fantasies, symbols, and emotions become the language through which the psyche communicates its hidden truths. By attending to these inner messages, the individual can begin to understand the sources of their pain and the nature of their conflict. This understanding fosters self-compassion and a deeper relationship with the self, which are essential for healing. Integral to this process is the integration of the fragmented parts of the self. The split between desire and fear, hope and despair, light and shadow must be acknowledged and reconciled. The addict learns to hold these opposites within consciousness, recognizing that wholeness is not the absence of conflict, but the embrace of complexity. The inner struggle becomes a dynamic tension that can fuel growth and creativity rather than paralysis and despair. The journey toward healing also involves developing new ways of relating to pain and conflict. Instead of fleeing or numbing, the individual cultivates the capacity to sit with discomfort, to listen to what the pain reveals, and to allow it to transform consciousness. This shift often requires supportive relationships and communities that offer acceptance and understanding, creating a container for the painful process of self-discovery. Spiritual traditions throughout history have recognized the necessity of this confrontation with inner pain and conflict. The dark night of the soul, the hero's descent into the underworld, and the shaman's journey into the abyss are metaphors for the transformative journey that addiction invites. The addict's suffering can be seen as a passage through this descent, a call to deeper self-knowledge and renewal. In this perspective, addiction is both a tragedy and an opportunity. The tragedy lies in the suffering and destruction caused by the attempt to escape pain. The opportunity lies in the potential for awakening that emerges when the flight is relinquished and the inner conflict is embraced. The pain that once threatened to overwhelm becomes a teacher and a guide, leading the individual toward a more authentic and integrated life. This transformation does not erase the wounds, but changes the relationship to them. The addict moves from victimhood to agency, from fragmentation to wholeness, from despair to hope. The addictive behavior loses its power as the deeper needs it expressed are met in healthier, more conscious ways. Understanding addiction as an attempt to escape inner conflict also challenges prevailing approaches that focus solely on external control or moral judgment. It invites a more compassionate and holistic response that addresses the root causes of suffering. It calls for interventions that support psychological exploration, emotional healing, and spiritual growth alongside physical and behavioral treatment. This approach recognizes that addiction is ultimately about the search for relief from existential pain and the yearning for wholeness. It honors the complexity of the human condition and the resilience of the soul. By engaging with the inner conflict rather than fleeing it, the addict opens the door to a new relationship with self and life, one marked by depth, meaning, and transformation. The journey toward healing from addiction is not a simple linear path, nor merely a matter of overcoming external behaviors. It is a profound inner process that calls for the integration of the whole self, a reconciliation of the divided psyche into a harmonious and living unity. Healing in this deepest sense transcends the mere cessation of substance use or compulsive behavior. It involves a transformation of the individual's relationship to themselves, their shadow, and their unconscious forces. The fragmented self, torn apart by addiction's grip, must be restored through a conscious and deliberate effort to embrace all aspects of the psyche, the light and the dark, the conscious and unconscious, the known and the hidden. At the heart of this process lies the recognition that the self is inherently complex and multidimensional. To be human is to embody a constellation of conflicting impulses, desires, fears, and potentials. The ego, which represents the conscious sense of identity, is but one part of this larger system. The unconscious, composed of the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, holds vast stores of psychic material that are often alien to the conscious mind. This unconscious content includes the shadow, the anima or animus, archetypal images, and deep-seated emotional wounds. For healing to occur, the individual must engage in a process of dialogue and reconciliation between these parts, allowing the unconscious to reveal itself and be integrated into conscious awareness. Addiction often arises from the rupture or fragmentation of the self. The ego, in its attempts to maintain control and deny uncomfortable truths, suppresses or disowns parts of the psyche. These disowned parts accumulate in the shadow, growing in power and influence beneath the surface. The addictive behavior becomes a symptom of this internal disintegration, an expression of psychic conflict and pain. Without addressing this underlying fragmentation, any recovery is fragile and prone to relapse. True healing requires more than surface-level change. It demands the reconstruction of a unified self. Integration of the whole self begins with acknowledgement, the courageous act of facing what has been hidden, denied, or rejected. The addict must be willing to look honestly at the parts of themselves that they have tried to avoid. The feelings of shame, anger, fear, loneliness, and despair. This process is not about blame or self-condemnation, but about compassionate acceptance. Each disowned part holds a message, a truth about the self's needs and wounds. By bringing these into the light of consciousness, the individual gains the capacity to understand and transform them. The unconscious often speaks through symbols, dreams, and projections. Engaging with these symbolic expressions offers a pathway to integration. Dreams, in particular, provide a rich source of insight, as they bypass the censoring ego and reveal the dynamics of the unconscious. By attending to dreams and allowing their images to speak, the individual can uncover hidden conflicts, fears, and desires. This dialogue between conscious and unconscious forms the basis for wholeness. Another crucial aspect of integration is the reconciliation of opposites within the psyche. Addiction often reflects a polarity between competing desires, between the need for freedom and the need for security, between the longing for connection and the impulse toward isolation, between vitality and numbness. The healing journey involves holding these opposites in tension without succumbing to either extreme. This balancing act requires maturity and flexibility, qualities that emerge from sustained inner work. The process of integration also entails embracing the shadow, that part of the self that contains rejected traits and impulses. While the shadow is often feared as a source of darkness and destruction, it also harbors vitality, creativity, and strength. When acknowledged and integrated, the shadow becomes a source of empowerment rather than fragmentation. The addict learns to transform the destructive energies that once fueled addiction into constructive expressions of life. This transformation is facilitated by active imagination, a technique that encourages the conscious mind to engage with unconscious images and feelings. Through dialogue with inner figures or symbolic enactment, the individual creates a bridge between the conscious and unconscious realms. This dialogue fosters understanding, healing, and the emergence of new perspectives. The integration of the anima, or animus, the contrasexual archetype within the psyche, is also significant. These inner figures represent the feminine aspect within the male psyche and the masculine aspect within the female psyche. Addiction can involve disturbances in these relationships to inner gendered energies, manifesting as imbalance or repression. Healing requires acknowledging and harmonizing these aspects, which enrich the personality and promote psychological wholeness. Furthermore, integration is not an isolated endeavor, but unfolds within relational and communal contexts. Healing from addiction often depends on the presence of empathetic others, who can witness the individual's struggle without judgment. Supportive relationships provide a container for the vulnerable process of self-exploration and transformation. They model acceptance and compassion, qualities that the addict may have lacked internally. Rituals and symbolic acts can also support the integration process. Ceremonies, creative expression, and spiritual practices create a space for marking transition and transformation. These acts connect the individual to larger patterns of meaning and offer a sense of participation in the sacred dimensions of life. The path to integration often involves confronting and working through grief and loss. Addiction frequently conceals unresolved mourning over lost parts of the self, broken relationships, or existential losses. The capacity to mourn openly and fully is an important step toward healing. Mourning allows the individual to release what must be let go and to make room for new growth. A key to sustaining integration is the development of self-awareness and mindfulness. By cultivating a habit of observing one's inner experience with curiosity and acceptance, the addict learns to recognize early signs of conflict and distress. This awareness interrupts automatic patterns of avoidance and compulsion, and creates space for conscious choice. Mindfulness practices anchor the individual in the present moment, reducing the pull of past wounds and future anxieties. Healing through integration is also deeply spiritual. It involves encountering the mystery and depth of the psyche, a realm that transcends the ego's limited perspective. This spiritual dimension recognizes that the self is not a static entity but a dynamic process of becoming. The integration of the whole self is a step toward individuation, the realization of the unique pattern of the individual's being. Addiction, viewed in this light, becomes a chapter in the soul's journey, a call to deeper awakening rather than a final condemnation. The suffering it entails holds the possibility of insight and renewal. The addict's willingness to engage in the difficult work of integration opens the door to a life that is richer, more authentic, and more deeply connected to the inner and outer worlds. This work is never complete. Integration is a lifelong process of unfolding and transformation. The self continually expands and evolves as new experiences and challenges arise. The capacity to integrate the whole self fosters resilience and flexibility, allowing the individual to navigate life's complexities with greater wisdom and grace. The commitment to the integration requires patience and perseverance. The ego must learn humility in the face of the unconscious, recognizing that true healing comes from partnership rather than domination. The addict moves from a stance of fragmentation and conflict toward one of harmony and balance. In this journey, the addict becomes not only a survivor, but a participant in the creative process of self-realization. The once fragmented parts find expression in new forms, contributing to a life that is vibrant and meaningful. The self is reborn through integration, emerging from the shadows into a fuller light. In the unfolding of this exploration, we have seen how addiction is far more than a mere habit or a physical dependence. It is a profound expression of the inner struggles that reside within the human soul, a cry from the depths for relief from conflict, pain, and fragmentation. It calls our attention to the divided nature of the self, the shadows we fear to face, and the parts we often deny. Yet within this suffering lies a hidden invitation, the possibility of transformation through the courageous journey of integration. Healing is not a destination but a path that requires us to embrace the whole of who we are, to reconcile the opposites within, and to find unity amidst the complexities of the psyche. May you find strength in this understanding, courage in your own confrontation with shadow and light, and patience as you walk the path toward wholeness. Remember that healing is a sacred process, one that calls for compassion, for oneself and for others. May the journey lead you toward greater freedom, deeper meaning, and a life lived with authenticity and grace. Thank you for your openness and presence in this shared reflection. I wish you all the very best on your path ahead.